You're asking my wife to leave. The words sliced through the air like a blade, clean, sharp, impossible to ignore. Drop your city in the comments and tell us, was this a simple oversight or a system showing its true face? It began that morning with sunlight washing over Alina Moore's kitchen counter. There, amid half-read journals and the quiet clink of a teacup, sat an envelope. Not just any envelope, ivory with gold embossing so rich it shimmered in the light like it carried secrets. Alina studied it for a moment before sliding her finger beneath the flap. Inside was an invitation, the kind that whispered exclusivity with every cursive stroke. But this wasn't another keynote or lecture series. This was personal. A birthday celebration for Madison Langford, the daughter of Cynthia and Richard Langford, partners in one of her husband's many real estate ventures. Vivre Blanc, the restaurant printed in raised gold lettering, wasn't just expensive, it was infamous. Tables booked months in advance, menus that spoke in symbols instead of prices, and an unspoken dress code written in linen, leather, and legacy. Her husband Jordan had mentioned the party weeks ago casually over dinner. They asked if we'd attend, he'd said in between bites of wild salmon. You said yes, for both of us, he smiled. You'll enjoy it. But Alina had learned to hear beneath the surface. This wasn't just a gathering, it was a performance, and she was being cast without her consent. She wasn't unfamiliar with spaces like this. She just no longer felt compelled to prove she belonged in them. Still, that morning, she held the envelope longer than expected, not out of fear, out of clarity. These were the rooms where skin tone was weighed, before credentials where silence could become suffocation if you weren't careful. But today she wasn't going for validation, she was going to be present. Jordan would arrive later, tied up in meetings until mid-afternoon. Alina saw no reason to wait. She would enter on her own terms. She dressed with deliberate simplicity, a white slip dress that whispered elegance without screaming for approval. Her jewelry minimal, her bag small and unbranded, her hair a cascade of soft coils pulled back into a low, dignified bun. Nothing about her said guest trying to impress. Everything about her said guest who deserves to be here. By 3:30 p.m., the Uber glided to a stop outside Vivre Blanc. The building gleamed all chrome and quiet arrogance. The valet opened her door with a neutral smile, eyes flickering with that half-second calculation reserved for unfamiliar variables. Alina stepped out anyway, chin-high steps measured. Inside the restaurant breathed prestige. The air smelled like champagne and truffle oil. The lighting was engineered to flatter. The floors reflected more than just heels, they reflected expectation. She approached the hostess stand. "Good afternoon," she said. "I'm here for Madison Langford's birthday party. Alina Moore." Amber, the young blonde hostess, gave a polite nod and flipped through the reservation book. Leather-bound, traditional, performative. Her eyes scanned, then paused. "I'm sorry I don't see that name listed." Alina's smile didn't falter. "My husband Jordan Moore confirmed it directly. We were invited by the Langfords. He reserved table 3 by the garden window." Amber hesitated, her lips pulled tight in that familiar expression Alina had seen too many times, not rude, not overt, just coded, just enough. One moment she said, turning to whisper to another hostess, "Then the manager will assist you." Alina stepped aside. The world moved on around her as if she weren't there, not invisible but not acknowledged either. Guests streamed past, laughter drifted, dresses sparkled, champagne glasses clinked. She waited. 5 minutes, 10. Then she heard it. "Miss Langley, welcome. Table 3 is ready." Her breath caught, her head turned slowly. A blonde woman in emerald silk swept toward the hostess stand with the comfort of a woman used to deference. Alina stepped forward. Calm, firm. "Excuse me, that's the table my husband reserved for me." Amber blinked. "I'm sorry, ma'am. There must have been a mix-up. Miss Langley is a regular. That table's been reserved for weeks." Alina didn't raise her voice, but inside something began to steal. She didn't know yet that power was already making its way down the street, quiet and electric. She didn't know that the story was about to shift. But the line had just been drawn. The garden window, the one Jordan had reserved, now sat behind Veronica Langley like a throne she hadn't earned. Alina stood motionless, but her silence was not surrender. It was study, observation, the kind of silence that gathers its edges before it speaks. The man who stepped into frame next was the manager. His name tag read Gareth Simmons. Slicked back hair, a navy suit tailored too tightly across his ambition, and a practiced half smile that tried to soften the edges of what was coming. "I'm sorry," Gareth said, that smile curving just a little too high. "The table is no longer available. We can seat you. Near the kitchen. It's quieter there." It was said with the casual tone of someone who thought he was offering a favor, a solution, a consolation prize. But Alina wasn't a woman who had built her career on quiet corners. She raised an eyebrow, nothing more, and said evenly, "You're offering me a seat by the kitchen while someone else sits at the table reserved in my name." Gareth shrugged. These things happen. The implication was clear. You were the mix-up, not the system, not the hostess, not the assumption. You. Alina's spine straightened, her hands relaxed at her sides, but her fingers curled slightly small fists of composure. Still, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't threaten. She didn't demand. But inside her something coiled, a recognition, a knowing. She had walked into rooms like this before, ones where power hid behind manners and prejudice wore perfume. But today it was wearing a name tag. She opened her mouth to respond. And that's when it happened. The soft electric purr from outside, not loud, not dramatic, but enough to interrupt the hush of curated indulgence inside Vivre Blanc. The doors parted, heads turned, and Jordan Moore walked in. He didn't need to say a word, because some men don't announce their power. They are the announcement. He wasn't dressed like the elites who equated logos with identity. His charcoal grey suit was whisper smooth, his gait precise, his presence loud in its stillness. And his eyes found hers across the room as if nothing else existed. He didn't stop to greet anyone, didn't glance at Gareth, didn't nod at the guests. He walked straight to Alina. "You've been standing here this whole time?" he asked, voice low but steel-laced. She tilted her head toward the hostess stand. "They said there was no reservation. They gave the table to someone else." Jordan's gaze turned slow, deliberate. It landed on Gareth. "You gave away the table my wife reserved." It wasn't a question. It was an indictment. Gareth flinched but still tried to smile. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding, Mr. Moore. We didn't realize that this guest was my wife." Jordan finished each word sharper than the one before. And just like that, the room inhaled. Because now it was no longer a question of seating. It was a question of who had been seen and who had been ignored. Jordan stepped closer to Gareth. And if she hadn't been my wife, would her reservation have reappeared? Gareth's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Amber, the hostess, looked down at her hands. The ambient music softened, and the facade of exclusivity began to crack. Alina didn't move. She didn't need to. She had already arrived. And now so had the reckoning. The room no longer held the warmth of truffle oil and curated conversation. It held breath. Jordan's voice, though calm, resonated with the gravity of something ancient truth being unearthed. "It was simply a miscommunication," Gareth said, words brittle with fear. "We had a last-minute request from a valued guest." "Which guest?" Jordan asked. He already knew. The room did too. "Miss Langley," Gareth mumbled. Alina didn't blink. "Veronica Langley," she said flatly. "The same woman who's been on 3 diversity panels this year and still looked me over like I was housekeeping." Jordan's lips pressed into a thin line. His silence was heavier than most men's fury. He took another step forward. Gareth instinctively stepped back. "You gave my wife's table to a woman who walked in without a reservation," Jordan said, tone clipped. "Because she looked more like your version of a VIP." And then his voice dropped lower, colder. "You offered my wife a seat by the kitchen, like she should be grateful to be let in at all." A silence fell so thick, it felt textured. Even the pianist faltered, his melody dissolving into scattered notes. Around them, conversations stalled. Guests stared but pretended not to. Waitstaff hovered, hands frozen in mid-pour. The restaurant's practiced elegance had curdled into tension. Gareth swallowed, trying to recover some semblance of control. "Mr. Moore, of course, if we had known, you didn't need to know," Jordan cut in sharply. "You only needed to honor the reservation, respect the name, the human being standing in front of you." And then, for the first time, he turned to address the entire room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. This is why I stayed in the background, he said, voice cool and deliberate. To see how this place truly operates. I've heard the rumors, seen the patterns. But today you gave me proof. You thought my wife didn't belong because she didn't show up wrapped in sequins and European arrogance. Because her presence wasn't loud enough for your narrow definition of worth. You made a judgment. And you buried her name under your bias. The ripple that followed wasn't sound, it was stillness. Pure and paralyzing. At table 3, Veronica Langley sipped from her crystal flute and offered a tight-lipped smirk, her discomfort barely concealed beneath years of practiced composure. "This is getting dramatic," she said with a thin laugh. "I'm sure we can all be adults about this." Jordan didn't even glance at her. His attention stayed locked on Gareth, who now looked like a man unraveling at the seams of his own privilege. "My name," Jordan said, voice steady as Jordan Elijah Moore. "I am the majority shareholder of this establishment. And the woman you just tried to erase," he turned slightly, extending his hand. "She is Dr. Alina Moore, tenured professor at Westbridge University, published scholar, and the only person in this room who doesn't need to prove she belongs." Alina placed her hand in his, not out of sentiment, but as a declaration. They walked together toward table 3, a current of reckoning trailing behind them, and the table that had once been used to diminish her now waited in silence like a throne reclaimed. Table 3 gleamed beneath the chandelier, its pristine linen untouched, its place settings symmetrical and sterile, waiting. But Veronica Langley hadn't moved. She sat like royalty, refusing exile, legs crossed, stemware in hand, spinning her rosé as though it could shield her from the truth settling around her like ash. Jordan stopped just short of the table, his hand never left Alina's. "Ms. Langley," he said, cool and composed, "I believe you're in the wrong seat." Veronica looked up slowly, a lazy smile stretching across her lips. Her tone was dripping in practiced innocence. "Oh, I had no idea this table was such a point of contention. I assumed it was first come, first served." She sipped, then added with a chuckle, "But if it means that much to her." To her, Alina cut in, voice sharp and crystalline. "This wasn't about comfort. This was about principle. But to you, it's always just been convenience dressed as entitlement." The room flinched, not visibly, but viscerally. It was the way some guests stiffened in their chairs, the way cutlery hesitated mid-air, the way a woman at the bar instinctively lowered her wineglass to listen more closely. Alina didn't shout. She didn't plead. Her words came out measured and exact, every syllable slicing through the satin veil of so-called civility Veronica wore like a defense mechanism. Veronica stood then slowly, like it was her gift to the room. She brushed the front of her dress as if dusted by proximity. "Well," she said lightly, "I suppose we're all learning our place today, aren't we?" Jordan didn't respond. He didn't need to. He stepped aside and pulled out Alina's chair. She sat with the quiet power of a woman reclaiming more than a seat. She was reclaiming space, visibility, truth. Gareth reappeared, then hovering just beyond a decorative pillar, like a man unsure if he still belonged on his own floor. Behind him were 2 security guards, dark suits, unreadable expressions, badges tucked subtly beneath lapels. Alina noticed them immediately. She leaned slightly forward, her eyes narrowing. "You've got to be kidding." Gareth stepped closer. "Mr. Moore," he began, feigning authority he no longer possessed. "We've had a request from another guest. They're hoping to de-escalate the tension. Perhaps it's best if we relocate Moore to a more private section." Jordan cut him off before he could finish the sentence. "Let me stop you right there. Are you suggesting that my wife be moved because someone else is uncomfortable with her sitting at her own reserved table?" Gareth hesitated. "It's merely a courtesy suggestion, sir." Something inside Alina broke loose. Not in chaos, in clarity. She rose slowly, deliberately, and placed her hands gently on the edge of the table. "To be clear," she said, her voice like silk woven with steel, "after you erased my reservation, offered me a seat by the kitchen, gave my table to someone else, and watched her mock me in front of this entire room. You now want to remove me again." She turned to the guards, who shifted slightly, unsure of their allegiance. "You want them to drag me out too, because I promise you I've survived worse than this velvet-lined circus." Her words didn't rise, they burned. One of the guards dropped his eyes. Gareth paled. "Dr. Moore, please understand." "No," Jordan said, stepping beside her now. "You understand." His voice had shifted deeper, firmer, final. "From this moment forward, we are no longer speaking as manager and investor. We are speaking as two men on opposite sides of a lawsuit." The words snapped through the room like thunder. Someone at a nearby table dropped their fork. Gareth's smile vanished. "This isn't necessary," he croaked. "It became necessary," Jordan replied, "the moment you decided my wife's presence was an inconvenience to be relocated. The moment your bias became company policy." He turned slightly, addressing the room, not for drama but for truth. This place decided whiteness equaled priority. Everything else, a seat near the kitchen. The silence that followed was not the absence of sound, it was the presence of guilt. Alina inhaled deeply, slow-centered, as though reclaiming the air the room had denied her. She sat again, not in retreat, but in reckoning. And Jordan's hand landed gently on her shoulder, not to comfort, but to anchor. Then he looked at Gareth, who now resembled a man adrift. "You have 1 hour," he said. "Clear your schedule. I'm calling an emergency meeting with the board." He paused. "And don't even think about touching the reservation logs. We already have a copy." Then, without another word, he took his seat beside Alina. And suddenly every eye in that restaurant knew this had never been just about a table. It had always been about power, and who gets to decide who belongs. The sun dipped low behind the wisteria-draped courtyard as the velvet silence inside Vivre Blanc thickened, not with elegance, but with reckoning. Every eye trailed Jordan and Alina as they sat at table 3, no longer a table, but a stage. The chairs around them weren't just furniture. They were evidence, symbols of who had been erased and who had returned to claim their name. Across the room, whispers were beginning to flow like spilled wine. The restaurant wasn't breathing. It was holding its breath. At the far end, Gareth huddled near the bar, his posture stiff, his composure unraveling thread by thread. He had been reduced from orchestrator to bystander, from authority to liability. And still, he couldn't let go. He reappeared once more as if clinging to remnants of relevance. This time flanked by 2 security guards again. "Mr. Moore." He began strained but civil. "I'd like to offer a more peaceful experience." "Perhaps," no, Jordan said, not even glancing up. "You've offered enough." But Gareth pressed on. "We believe it's best if Dr. Moore dines in a more private area. To de-escalate the atmosphere." Alina's eyes lifted slowly, her voice cold and clear. "De-escalate? As whose discomfort?" She stood again. This time, not just as a professor or a guest, but as a woman who had spent a lifetime holding her breath in rooms just like this. After being erased from the list, publicly humiliated, offered a table next to the service door, and now that the truth has arrived with credentials and consequences, "You think the answer is to remove me?" She turned to the guards. "What happens next? You carry me out for daring to sit where I belong." One of them shifted, uncomfortable. She didn't blink. "I have walked into boardrooms where I was the only person of color. I have defended research that others mocked until it was quoted in their own publications. And now you think I will let you ghost me in real time and call it etiquette?" She leaned in, not in threat, but in declaration. "I'm not leaving. I'm not moving. And I'm not shrinking." The guards stepped back instinctively. Gareth's words stumbled from his lips. This wasn't personal. It was operational. Jordan finally rose, slow and silent, like the calm before a targeted storm. "Let me be clear," he said, facing Gareth head-on. "You're not speaking to the press right now, or your staff, or the kinds of guests you think you can placate with dessert wine. You're speaking to your majority shareholder." He pulled out his phone, unlocked it with a swipe, and turned the screen toward Gareth. On it was the digital reservation, time-stamped, confirmed, and under one name only: Alina Moore. "We didn't just bring receipts," he said, voice like granite. "We brought the whole archive." The entire restaurant had stilled. No more clinking glasses, no more fake smiles, just a brittle quiet cracking beneath the weight of revelation. And then something shifted again, not in volume, but in clarity. A waiter barely out of his 20s approached their table. He didn't speak, just gently placed 2 glasses of wine down along with a folded black napkin. He turned and walked away without looking back. Alina unfolded it slowly. Inside, written in looping pen strokes, "You weren't the first." Jordan read it over her shoulder, his voice dropped to a whisper edged with steel. Then it's time to make sure. You're the last. At precisely 7:30 p.m., while guests at Vivre Blanc pretended their entrees weren't seasoned with tension, a very different scene unfolded behind a frosted glass door labeled staff only. Inside the boardroom waited sleek obsidian table, leatherback chairs, soft lighting that once made egos feel at ease. But tonight it wasn't lit for power. It was lit for accountability. Jordan Moore sat at the head of the table, posture relaxed fingers, steepled eyes calm, the calm of someone holding a detonator not out of vengeance but out of duty. Alina wasn't there. Her part was done. This wasn't her war. This was cleanup. Across from him sat the board, 6 men and women in designer suits, their expressions shifting between concern, confusion, and denial. They had read the incident report, but Jordan hadn't called them here for the version written in passive voice. He was here for the truth behind the silence. Gareth Simmons entered last. Gone was the polished air of a man in control. He looked like he hadn't exhaled since being called to this meeting. He clutched a slim leather portfolio, useless now. There was no chair assigned to him. He took the farthest empty seat without being asked, and no one welcomed him. Jordan's voice broke the hush. This emergency meeting has been called under Clause 12 of our charter, gross misconduct requiring executive review. No raised voice, no dramatics, just truth with the weight of law. One of the older board members cleared his throat. Jordan, I understand the situation was regrettable, but are we certain this response isn't disproportionate? Gareth has been with us since the beginning. Jordan turned slightly. And what exactly has he built? A reputation, an experience, or a quiet culture of exclusion? Dressed in curated elegance, he tapped a pad on the table. A projector dropped silently from the ceiling. The screen flickered to life with a color-coded spreadsheet. Names, dates, timestamps. Jordan stood. There have been 17 documented instances over the past 6 months where minority guests were unable to be located in the system. Click. In 12 of those cases, their tables were reassigned within 15 minutes. To white guests. Click. All 17 had one common factor: Gareth Simmons had override access at the time of the change. The room went still. Not frozen. Exposed. Gareth tried to recover. With all due respect, we make adjustments every day, based on VIP needs, walk-ins, special circumstances. Jordan turned slowly. And systemic bias, is that also on the menu? No one spoke. No one moved. Jordan continued. This isn't about a glitch, it's about a pattern, one you perpetuated, one you cultivated. He stepped forward, voice tightening. You thought invisibility was protection. You believed that by staying within the bounds of manners, your actions couldn't be called what they were. He paused. But I'm not here to negotiate. From his jacket, he pulled a document, thick, stapled and signed. Here is your termination notice. Effective immediately. All access revoked. HR will handle your exit. He placed the folder gently on the table, like a judge placing a verdict. Gareth's jaw clenched. You're going to erase me over one mistake. No, Jordan replied. You erased yourself over 17. He didn't yell. He didn't need to, because power doesn't need volume. It needs evidence. And now everyone had seen it. Gareth stood abruptly, looking around the room for anyone to save him. But no one met his gaze. His silence had once been their shared convenience. Now it was his cage. He turned and walked out. The door clicked behind him like the last nail in a coffin. Jordan sat again, looked around the boardroom. We rebuild from here. Not quietly, not politely, transparently. One of the younger members nodded. It's bold, but it's time. Jordan didn't smile. He didn't need to. The revolution had already begun. The next morning, the reckoning spilled past the marble walls of Vivre Blanc and into the bloodstream of the city. The headline dropped just after dawn. Vivre Blanc rocked by racial bias scandal, majority shareholder fires GM after pattern of discrimination uncovered. It was a scalpel, not a scream, surgical and damning. And it didn't take long before the rest of the world joined the conversation. Jordan hadn't leaked the report, but he didn't flinch when it spread. Truth, once unboxed, didn't need an escort. It sprinted. Within 12 hours, Vivre Blanc's Yelp page was flooded not by rage but by memory. Quiet stories surfaced like bruises under skin. My father wore his best suit and still got seated near the kitchen. I always thought it was just bad luck. I see now it was pattern. I asked for table by the window. They gave it to a blonde who walked in after me. Each one a match. Together a fire. But it was Alina's response that turned the spark into an ember with permanence. No press conference, no viral video, just a post on her university's blog where she was listed as a visiting ethics lecturer. When you have to fight to be seen in a place you helped finance, you begin to understand that exclusion wears many faces, some smiling, some silent. But silence is never neutral. No hashtags, no flair, but within an hour it had been shared over 10,000 times. And by lunch, the mayor's office called. Jordan's chief of staff entered his penthouse office, eyes sharp, tablet in hand. They want to meet. Minimize political fallout, their words. Friday, Jordan said, and make sure they read the full audit first. She hesitated. Also, 3 employees from other luxury restaurants have come forward. They're calling it the invisible velvet rope. Hidden discrimination, pattern level. Jordan's gaze moved to the skyline outside his window, banners flapping with the city's promise of inclusion. The irony wasn't lost on him. Get me names, he said. If it's a network, we follow every thread. By mid-afternoon, a coalition of entrepreneurs had already been formed. A task force was launched to audit upscale establishments, reviewing reservation logs, service records, guest feedback, and incident reports. Vivre Blanc was no longer just a scandal. It was a precedent, and with precedent came pressure. At 5:45 p.m., Jordan's phone lit up with a number he recognized. Richard Langley, uncle to Veronica. Partner in real estate ventures. Patriarch of a family that preferred their privilege silent and their image polished. You've made your point, Richard said. You've humiliated good people, good businesses. Let's talk about dialing it back before this becomes a crusade. Jordan didn't pause. It is a crusade, and he hung up. Back at Vivre Blanc, the transformation was already underway. The lights were dimmed, the tables stripped, the guests gone, but the staff servers, cooks, hosts were still there. Not for reprimand, but for reckoning. Jordan stood in the center of the dining hall. No podium, no title. Some of you have witnessed it. Some of you lived through it. And some of you stayed quiet to keep your jobs, he said plainly. I'm not here to punish fear. I'm here to end complicity. He paused. From now on, you report to leadership who know what it means to be overlooked and still show up. A young black server named Isaiah raised his hand hesitant. Are we really safe to speak now? I've been passed up for promotion twice, and the last time I asked, they cut my hours. Jordan nodded once. You're safe, and as of now promoted. Head of guest relations. Effective immediately. The room exhaled not in cheer, but in release. And then the hands went up, story after story, small indignities, silent punishments, performative hierarchies. It wasn't a staff meeting. It was an unburdening. By the end of the week, Jordan rolled out the reforms across every one of his ventures. AI-assisted bias, tracking in reservations. Anonymous reporting channels, mandatory third-party oversight and equity training. The press called it radical, competitors called it reckless, but the public, they called it right. And then the most unexpected call came. Veronica. Not with an apology, with a proposal. My family wants this to go away. We'll donate. We'll endorse your reforms. We'll pull our investments if you need. Just stop dragging our name. Jordan listened, let the silence settle, then said, your name isn't being dragged. It's being revealed. And maybe it's time people saw what hides behind a smile. She hung up. But it didn't matter. The dominoes had already begun to fall. Fashion. Tech. Publishing. Across industries, others inspired by Vivre Blanc's reckoning began speaking out, and through it all, Alina stayed mostly silent. She had already spoken the most important truth. She had refused to vanish. By the time Friday evening wrapped the city in gold, Vivre Blanc stood transformed not with a press release, but with presence. A black SUV with tinted windows pulled quietly to the curb. No paparazzi, no flashbulbs, but every staff member standing near the entrance straightened instinctively. Alina stepped out first. She wore ivory silk, soft and fluid, like memory. Her natural curls framed her face, and the sun caught a warm shimmer on her skin. No designer logos, no bold red lips, nothing to prove, everything to remember. Beside her, Jordan stepped out in a slate-grey suit, the kind of understated that made luxury feel irrelevant. He didn't need to lead the moment. He just held her hand and let her. They walked forward as the double doors opened, not with routine but reverence. Inside, waiting near the entrance, was Isaiah, no longer a server, now head of guest relations. His tailored black blazer bore the restaurant's crest stitched in gold thread. He offered a nod, not robotic, not exaggerated, just real. "Dr. Moore." "Mr. Moore," he said, voice steady. "Welcome back to Vivre Blanc. Your table is ready." Alina inclined her head. "Thank you, Isaiah." There was no need to exchange meaning. It was already there in every eye that now watched with respect instead of suspicion. They moved through the space slowly, not to make a scene, but because reclaiming something stolen takes its own kind of ceremony. Conversation softened. Staff stood straighter. Patrons quieted not from fear but from recognition. And then they arrived at table 3. The same one, same garden window, same white linen, same view of the wisteria. But now a single bouquet of white peonies sat at the center. A silent gesture. A promise. Isaiah pulled out Alina's chair. Jordan's hand brushed the back of hers as she sat. This time he said softly, taking his seat across from her, "You lead the conversation." She smiled faintly, not in triumph, but in reflection. "Let's see if the room's finally ready to listen." Their server approached a young woman named Natalie. She carried herself with a visible mix of awe and focus. "It's an honor to serve you both," she said gently, placing 2 menus on the table. "Chef Amari asked me to let you know tonight's tasting menu was inspired by women who lead without needing to raise their voice." Alina raised an eyebrow, a soft laugh escaping her lips. "That's quite a theme." Natalie nodded. "He said you'd understand." The evening unfolded slowly but not like before. This wasn't performance. This was presence. Dignity not requested but assumed. A woman at the bar mouthed "thank you" as Alina passed. A man near the window nodded as Jordan glanced up. No applause, no cameras, just quiet shifts in posture, in gaze, in understanding. Halfway through dinner, Isaiah returned, but not with wine, with a small black envelope. "We had this framed," he said, setting it gently on the table. "Thought it should belong to you." Inside was a printout of the original reservation confirmation, Alina Moore table, 3:15 p.m., archived, time-stamped, framed behind glass. Alina stared at it for a long moment, her hands still, her breath quiet. Then she smiled. "Proof," she whispered, "that sometimes history keeps a receipt." Jordan chuckled softly. He raised his glass. "Not just for this table," he said, "but for every table that will never again be denied to someone because they don't look the part." They clinked glasses, not in celebration of revenge, but in recognition of reclamation. Behind them, a new photograph had been mounted on the wall. Black and white. A woman seated at a table turned slightly toward the light, her posture upright, her presence undeniable. Below it, a plaque read, "Table 3, where elegance redefined the rules." And in that moment, no one asked who she was. They already knew. Because from now on, the room belonged to her too. Monday arrived like a breath, long held, finally exhaled. The breeze that swept through the city didn't just carry the scent of spring, it carried shift. Something heavy had been lifted, something entrenched had been uprooted. And for the first time in years, Vivre Blanc opened its doors not as a fortress of exclusion, but as a vessel of change. The reservation desk now stood behind a digital kiosk, cloud-synced, tamper-proof, with logs and timestamps for every booking. There were no more leather-bound books meant to impress. There was transparency and truth. The woman now stationed at that desk was Maya. She wore her natural curls like a crown. Her navy blazer bore a new gold emblem, "Equity is the new luxury." She had once been told to smile more, speak less, and soften her voice to match the clientele. But not anymore. Now she set the tone. Inside, not much had changed physically, no dramatic renovations, no grand rebranding. But everything felt different. The lighting had been adjusted, not to spotlight wealth, but to illuminate everyone equally. The floor plan had been recentered not around prestige, but around visibility, and the menu, it spoke volumes. Each course was now prefaced by a short note, inspired by cultures whose food shaped the world, but whose names were too often left off the reservation list. Some guests raised eyebrows, a few whispered critiques, but most nodded. They understood. Or wanted to. The old Vivre Blanc had been about performance. The new Vivre Blanc was about presence. It no longer asked guests to blend in, but to show up. Behind the scenes, the transformation ran deeper still. The hiring process was rebuilt from the ground up. Anonymous screening, community outreach, equity in every layer. Isaiah, now the director of guest experience, implemented weekly listening sessions for staff, no longer optional, no longer performative. A space where grievances didn't get buried beneath champagne toasts. Jordan Moore, once the silent investor, now walked the floor weekly. Not as a shadow, but as a standard. He didn't hover. He listened, and when decisions needed to be made, he made them with voices that didn't look like his, but carried truth like his own. Word had begun to spread not just about the scandal, but about the reform. Other restaurateurs took note. Some copied out of fear, others out of faith. And as for Alina, her return to campus was quiet but different. Students who once admired her from a distance now approached her between lectures. "I read your statement. Thank you for saying what we couldn't. You made space for more than just yourself." She never boasted, never claimed heroism. She had never asked to be a movement, she had just refused to disappear. Her guest lecture, once titled Ethics in Emerging Systems, was renamed by the university without her asking, "The Geography of Power, whose table is it anyway?" Attendance tripled. She saved her story for the end, and when she spoke it wasn't about drama, it was about design. The system won't always call it exclusion. Sometimes it calls it preference, sometimes tradition, but what it's really doing is mapping who gets to exist at the center and who gets seated near the kitchen. She paused. But standards are not eternal, they're chosen. And we can choose better ones. And they had. Because the ripple wasn't just in the restaurant. It was everywhere. In Seattle, a luxury spa rewrote its intake policies after a client cited Alina's blog. In Atlanta, a jazz lounge quietly dropped its coded dress code. In New York, an upscale hotel installed bias detection software in its booking engine. No press release, just change. That's how revolutions sometimes happen. Not in fire, but in form. Late one night after the last guest had gone, Jordan stood alone inside Vivre Blanc's main dining hall. The soft amber glow bathed the room, casting long shadows that looked less like ghosts and more like memories. He walked to table 3, ran his fingers across the edge. A brass tag now marked its name, Dr. Alina Moore's table. Not for ownership, for legacy. Alina entered a moment later, her heels soft on polished floors. She paused beside him. "I thought I'd hate coming back here," she murmured. "But I don't." He turned to her. "Not hate," she smiled faintly. "No, because I don't just sit here now. I own the silence that used to swallow me." He looked at her for a long second, then said, "Not own. You rewrote it." They walked out to the terrace together. The city lights pulsed beneath them like a heartbeat. "Do you think it'll last?" she asked. Jordan was quiet. "Then it'll evolve. Some will resist, some will fake it, but enough will remember. And that's all it takes to shift the axis." She nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. "I didn't need to win the argument," she said. "I just needed the room to admit it was wrong." And somewhere inside the restaurant, a new sous chef, young Vietnamese, nervous but proud, left a note on the counter before heading home. "Thank you for building a room that finally fits me." Alina caught sight of it through the window. She didn't speak, but her smile deepened, because that, more than any article, any applause, or any plaque, was the revolution she had hoped for. Back inside, the future had already begun drafting itself quietly, boldly. Jordan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folder. Inside, proposals, expansion requests, and inquiries from 3 other cities, each asking the same question in different ways. "Can you replicate what happened at Vivre Blanc?" He laid the folder on the counter and turned to Alina. "They want the blueprint," he said. She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes lingered on the flickering candlelight near the window where the wisteria now framed not exclusivity, but remembrance. Then she turned to him, her voice low but clear. "Give them one," she said, "but make sure they understand the standard isn't the table. It's the courage to stand beside it, even when they're told they don't belong." Outside, the night settled soft and full, but inside Vivre Blanc something deeper stirred, a new kind of rhythm. Not dictated by expense accounts or social status, but by ethic, presence, intention. Because this wasn't just a makeover, this was a message. In the days that followed, subtle changes took root across the city. A renowned art gallery issued an apology for excluding local black artists from its last 3 exhibits. A tech startup restructured its leadership board after an internal report long ignored was finally taken seriously. A luxury brand replaced its seasonal campaign after quietly partnering with new consultants, ones that looked like the customers they never saw before. Change didn't thunder, it echoed, and the echo traced its way back to a table. Not a courtroom, not a protest, not a billboard. A table. Table 3, a place that had once been used to deny someone's presence, now preserved like architecture for what it proved that truth doesn't always need volume. Sometimes it just needs resistance. That weekend, a film crew reached out to Jordan's assistant, Netflix, HBO, independent producers. Everyone wanted the story. But Jordan declined. It wasn't for sale, because some legacies are louder when they're lived, not sold. Instead, he forwarded the inquiries to the university. "Ask Dr. Moore," he wrote. "She's the one who changed the room." But Alina, she was already back in the classroom, back to teaching, back to challenging minds, back to sitting at desks that had never been built for her, but now bowed slightly beneath her presence. At the end of a lecture, one student lingered behind, a young woman, mixed-race, soft-spoken eyes, wide with something close to awe. "Dr. Moore," she asked, "do you ever wish it had happened differently, that they had just gotten it right the first time?" Alina paused, then smiled. If they had, she said, there wouldn't be a blueprint. That evening, as she walked home with the breeze tugging at her coat, she passed a cafe window and caught her reflection. She didn't stop, but she nodded to herself, to the woman who had once been asked to leave, and now defined the standard by which rooms were judged. Because dignity doesn't ask permission. It arrives, it endures. It rewrites the map, and sometimes it leaves the door open behind it. If this story moved something inside, you don't let it settle in silence. Drop a comment. I won't sit quietly near the kitchen again. Subscribe for more stories like this, stories that don't just entertain, but ignite something that won't go back to sleep. And above all, share this with someone who's ever been told they didn't belong. Someone who's ever been moved, rejected, ignored. Let them know it's not about getting a seat. It's about knowing you already earned it. Because sometimes justice doesn't come with gavel strikes. Sometimes it comes with 4 simple words: your table is ready.